Welcome to our next discipleship class. So we ended up last time on this particular slide where we were just going to introduce, we had talked about the Euthyphro issue, Plato's classic dialogue with Euthyphro. We explained that. And now we're going to jump into basically the 7 major worldviews. And here's the question that we're going to answer. Why do we argue against atheism from a theistic worldview or a theistic framework? In other words, why is it that we take that position? Now, this is not a presentation where we're going to go through the whole apologetics piece, but I do want to bring some of it into this because it does apply and it gives us some of the context to which we need, especially where we're trying to answer atheism. So with that, these are the 7 major worldviews that we will look at. We'll look at them in this sequence. Deism, finite godism, pantheism, panentheism, polytheism, atheism, and theism. And as we go through these, we'll just kind of give a brief definition just so that we can have some context to what we're talking about. So deism, illustrated in the picture actually, is the fact that God is beyond the world, right? He is transcendent, but not in the world. So God is not part of the world. He transcends it. And God does not, this is the deistic issue that really separates it from theism, but does not do miracles, and he does not interact with the world. Now, again, we see this as inconsistent because of a number of reasons. One of which is the fact that you would have to assume that after the first miracle of creation, he decided to not do any others, and there's no way to logically establish that, especially with the evidence that we have over the years as we deal with the theistic God, which we get into later. So, next, because this violates reason and it is logically inconsistent, we'll move on to the next one. Finite godism. Now, this is, God is limited. In other words, he's finite, he's not infinite, of both power and perfection. So power in the ability to control. Notice that the hand is smaller than the world, not really able to control the world, is not really sovereign in that way, and lacks perfection because if he's limited, if he's finite, then he has room for improvement. So there's no perfection. He's not infinite in that sense. So a finite God created the world. That's what this worldview teaches. And God does not completely control the world. Evil, as the classic book by, I forget the rabbi's name, Why Do Good Things Happen to Bad Things Happen to Good People? Evil shows God is limited in power and or perfection. So he had come to that conclusion that the reason that, the assumption is that only good things should happen to what we consider good people, and God isn't able to control that, and therefore he also does not do miracles, because if he did, he'd be able to solve the problems that good people have. So again, this violates reason and is logically inconsistent, because if you have a limited God, then you're going to go into this infinite regress, because you ultimately have to have a God that is all-powerful and is infinite in order to create anything that's finite. Anything that is finite can possibly improve and change. That is not really the necessary, does not fit the necessary requirements of a theistic God, which is really the answer to the ultimate uncaused first cause of the universe. Pantheism. right? God is all. Pan is all. Theism, all is God. So notice that you have the hand and the globe all mixed up because they're all one and the same. So this is essentially Eastern pantheistic monism, and so it claims that we can change from illusion, which we're in now. For example, in Hinduism, they are pantheistic as well as polytheistic, which is a whole nother issue, but they believe that we are existing in an illusion, and then we go to enlightenment or on to reality. And the problem is, if we're in an illusion, we have to go out of the illusion to know that we're in it. You don't know that you're dreaming until you wake up. So again, there's some problems. Now, in pantheism, the view is that we are God, everybody's God. I suppose if you have to be told that, then maybe you should think twice about that. That we can change, yet God cannot change, not by definition, and not in his, again, we'll get to it, but the requirements or the necessity of what the eternal, infinite being that created everything would have to be cannot change. It recognizes the existence of opposing views, or yet claims they are an illusion. So you can't have in an illusion opposite views that are true. Violates non-contradiction as well as others, and so this again violates reason, is logically inconsistent, and cannot answer what God is capable of creating the entire universe and everything in it and all creation. So panentheism is similar, that God is all. However, there are two aspects of God. You see the hand beyond and then the hand mixed up as it is in pantheism. And so there's two poles in a sense. It claims God is self-caused, which is certainly impossible. That God and the world are mutually dependent, which is also impossible because you have to have God creating himself and then creating the world separately, which again is not possible. God is changing. This aspect of God is changing because we are God and we are changing, which is not possible without an unchanging basis for change. In other words, how do you know that there's any change in anything unless you can measure it against an absolute? You have to have an external referent, especially when you're dealing with issues that are transcendent beyond this world. So an ultimate eternal God is a reference point, and he is the referent for anything that is changing towards or away. But within panentheism, you don't have that. It also views God as imperfect. He's not perfect, which demands a perfect by which he is measured. Again, how do you determine that God's not perfect and needs to change? Well, you have to have something external to that and referent that is unchangeable. Otherwise, you don't know. This is the philosophical problems with these views before we even get into practice. So again, this violates reason and is logically inconsistent. Polytheism, many finite gods, which again you see all the different hands over the world. This has the problems of all the limited and finite God claims that we've already gone through. Multiple finite gods reveal a lack in each. In other words, something lacks in one that's not in another, hence the necessity for multiple. In other words, none are perfect or infinite. And so, this is the old concept of, the gods of Mount Olympus, the different ancient cultures with various gods that, especially the Greeks, that were always battling and fighting and had all the characteristics of people. And so when they did that, they were basically creating this polytheism because specifically they had gods that had these human frailties, and one lacked one thing, one lacked another. and they would battle it out. But again, it violates reason, and it is logically inconsistent. The only God that can exist is the theistic God. Again, in atheism, there's no God, infinite or finite, that exists. Evil exists and is evidence against God within much of atheism, not all, but much, and the majority of atheists would use the existence of evil as a reason that God does not exist. And we'll get into that because really you can't know what evil is without a theistic world framework. No miracles are possible because there's no God to do them. God is an illusion or projection of people. We just make God up. This is the Feuerbach argument from many years ago. And Feuerbach had the wish fulfillment, so a lot of atheists view us Christian as we would like to have a God exist, so that's why we wish for him, and then we just kind of create him, and that's our own thinking. What they don't understand is that we're reasoning from evidence the other way. We're coming to that as a conclusion. There is evidentiary reasons for a theistic God, and it really has nothing to do with wish fulfillment from Feuerbach. Again, this violates reason as we're going through in this presentation and is logically inconsistent in many areas. So theism, of which there are really only three theistic world religions. There's Judaism, Christianity, and the latecomer of Islam. And the only one that actually will currently, though Judaism did earlier, validated by miracles. When the prophets spoke, God validated them by making sure that his miraculous power accompanied what they were saying so that there could be a substantiation for their sermon, a miracle to substantiate the message, and there was verification. That ended, and that moved into Christianity, which was an outgrowth of Judaism, and then 600 years afterwards with Islam, there is no miraculous confirmation. There is no verification other than just the claims that are made, but there's no objective reference in either eyewitness material, historical material, or anything else that can verify what is claimed by Muhammad, that he is giving us the Word of God. This is done in a whole different presentation. I can't go into this here, but just so we know, for theism, God is not part of the world, but he transcends it very simply. God does miracles, and he can interact with the world, which he did and still does. So this supports reason and is logically consistent with everything that we know. So the only God, only the theistic God, meets all the necessary requirements. For example, what kind of God would be necessary to create the universe? In other words, what attributes would God have? And quite simply, he would have to be necessary. Obviously, he has to exist in order to create the universe. He has to be intelligent because there is design in created things. He has to be powerful. He has to be capable of controlling his creation. Otherwise, the creation could overpower him. He has to be purposeful. Design has a purpose. People do not design things for absolutely no reason. There has to be a purpose for creation, especially an orderly creation that is goal-directed, as we see in our world. He has to be personal. There has to be a will to create. Creation is not just something that spontaneously happens. Somebody has to want to do that, and they have to have a will to do it. He has to be transcendent, right, beyond space, time, and matter, because space, time, and matter had a beginning, had a starting point, and he would have none. He would be the ultimate uncaused first cause. And so he would be beyond everything. He would be non-contingent. In other words, he does not need the universe or anything else in order to exist. because he existed without it in the first place. He would be moral, which means he would establish right and wrong for his creation. Now, we've talked about that. That's based on his nature, and it's not just arbitrary. He would be engaged, in other words, does miracles and intervenes with the world, like we said, and he would be unique. He does not have an equal. He doesn't. There isn't another God out there that's equal to him. That wouldn't be possible. It's not like you have twin gods, because if you have two, there would be something different in the other one. Otherwise, they would be the same. So, a little revision: the truth about truth. Remember, contrary beliefs are possible, but contrary truths are not. This is what leads us to the view of a theistic God. We have to be able to work through things that are innate in our thinking ability the way that we are obviously designed. Non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, law of identity, these are self-evident. We've talked about them before, but based on those, in other words, if I can know what the truth is, the truth has to exist. For somebody to say, and we'll go into this in a minute, but to somebody to say, well, there is no truth, well, is that a truth? I mean, they're claiming a truth that there's no truth. In other words, their claim cannot survive the principle that they're stating. So remember, contrary beliefs are possible. Everybody has them. But contrary truths or not, it would violate non-contradiction. You can believe everything is true, but everything can't be true. Again, this is as simple as it gets, and it violates the law of non-contradiction. So objective truth can't be denied without being affirmed. So if a person was to say that, well, non-contradiction is not true, well, then you'd say, so you're using non-contradiction, in other words, that the opposite of what you're stating is not what you're stating. You have to use non-contradiction to try to deny it. So in trying to deny objective truth or absolute truth, you need to use that framework to affirm. You affirm that framework just in trying to establish the denial of it. So in regard to ethics and dealing with truth, we don't have a relative system. Truth is not relative. So we need to talk about conventionalism for a minute, because a lot of times atheists respond to issues regarding the truth, and they talk about what are the conventions. So this is the problem with swapping definitions. Conventionalism is whatever the conventions of a society are, that's what's true. Like you can vote on it, or let's say this is true or that's true because we want it to be true. Well, everybody, 51% of the people think 2 and 2 is 5. Do we change it? No, because we'd be changing a law that we know is false. It would be artificial. So replacing morality, which is really the subject that we're dealing with what the atheist website talks about, ethics, which is really dealing with morality. But when you replace morality with sociology as a standard for truth, it results in a society that decides what people ought to do based on, number one, societal convention or conventionalism, right? That'll be the result, the 51%. Truth is based on what people do, not what they ought to do in that scenario. Truth is decided by a majority. It's decided subjectively. Can we all vote? I think this is true. Yeah, I agree with you. Well, it may not be objectively. Instead of an external referent, which would be objectively, right? So if I'm trying to establish the truth subjectively, what I think that it should be or what I would like it to be, that is subject to me. Objective truth is external to me, and the fact is dealt with based on what correlates to that fact. So that's the difference between being subjective and objective. It's either related to me as the subject or the fact that is claimed, which would be objective. Whose society would be the best? Hitler or a loving leader who cared for everybody? In conventionalism, the failure is that if everybody decides that they're going to eliminate certain people, genocide, well, hey, we had a 51 majority, well, here we go, we start murdering people. That can't be right. That's absurd. Nobody would want to live in a society like that, which tells you that there's something wrong with it. This is the innate moral construct that God created us with. Truth or morality cannot be decided by majority vote. It isn't truth, in other words, objective truth, it's just opinion, it's subjective. So conventionalism doesn't work. Conventionalism is just basically grabbing a majority and say, if I can get you to agree with me, then we'll say this is true. But it may not be true. Now, the website goes into what is called enlightened self-interest. The Atheist website claims, quote, the principle of enlightened self-interest is an excellent first approximation to an ethical principle which is both consistent with what we know of human nature and is relevant to the problems of life in a complex society. That's a mouthful, but basically somehow enlightened self-interest solves their problem of morality. Now, so we know what that is. Enlightened self-interest, here's a definition. Enlightened self-interest was a concept that Alexis de Tocqueville discussed in his work, Democracy in America. He noted that Americans voluntarily joined together in associations to further the interests of the group and thereby to serve their own interests. These are moral decisions based on a theistic worldview, which America is based on. In an atheistic worldview, there are no enlightenment, resulting in moral actions. So de Tocqueville looked at it and he said, well, if somebody does good to their neighbor, it actually benefits them, so there's a motivation to do that. It's a selfish reason for doing good to somebody else. That's basically it. However, the point is that it's not the actions that we're talking about. Why do people feel the necessity to do them in the first place? Again, we'll get into that. Secondly, any measure of doing good implies that there is a standard for what good is. How do I know I'm doing good for my neighbor? I need to know what good is. In a materialistic worldview, which typically is atheism, this doesn't exist, right? Moral relativism, in other words, the truth is relative to something else, so there's no absolutes, and conventionalism are the resultant frameworks for attempting a moral framework. So basically, they're trying to construct a moral framework, but within an atheistic worldview, that's not actually possible. Moral relativism is self-defeating since it uses an absolute moral framework to claim there is no absolute morality. If somebody says there is no absolute morality, they're making an absolute claim. I don't know why this seems to escape people, but this is very straightforward. Morally relativistic positions conflict with the law of non-contradiction, though the law is affirmed or used when attempting to deny it, since it assumes that the opposite of the relativistic position is false, which defeats the argument of relativism. So obviously, if I'm trying to argue against an absolute and I have to use an absolute framework to argue against it and say this is opposite that, then I'm borrowing, or probably more accurately, stealing that framework to argue against it. A few examples will help us put this home, right? The university professor says there is no absolute truth. The answer, is that absolutely true? Again, the university professor here cannot survive the principle of his own claim. The truth changes. Does that truth change? is that the truth changes? Is that statement, is that absolute, or is that going to change? You see, it can't survive the principle of its own claim. That's true for you, but not for me. Is that true for you and not for me? In other words, is that true for everybody? Well, no, that's not the case, because there are things that people say, well, that's true for you, but not for me. But what they're stating isn't true for me, which means it's not true for everybody. All truth is relative. Is that relative? If somebody says that, well, all truth is, well, is the truth that you're claiming that everything is relative? Because you can't remove yourself from the principle of what you're stating. You can't be the only exclusive case, but everybody else has to fall into the claim. It doesn't work like that, right? Relativism fails its principal claim. There is no truth. Is that true? Well, obviously, that would be crazy, but you hear it all the time. That's postmodernism, right? No one really knows the truth. Is that true? Or how do you know that's true? Well, if nobody knows the truth, how can they tell me that? They're claiming that nobody knows the truth. They're saying that's a truth, but they're saying nobody can know it. All these things are self-defeating. Nothing is true for everyone. Is that true for everyone? Do you see? People need to think through what they are actually saying, because what they are saying oftentimes really makes no sense at all. How about pluralism? Opposites can both be true. Isn't the opposite of that false, right? So pluralism can't be true. Hey, all religions are true. Everything leads to God. And this certainly isn't related to atheism, but that can't be true, because you have different gods, different concepts of God, different belief systems. They're all in conflict. You can't have that. You can't have everything the same, but yet at the same time violating the principles that are stated. You know, everything's the same. Well, it's not all the same, because they're different, right? Because the opposite of what their claim is obviously false. Skepticism. You should doubt all truth claims. Should I doubt that? You can do this all day, right? So that's skepticism fails its own claim. So, enlightened self-interest, atheists, so we understand, atheists can talk about morality and find reasons for actions that are moral. They just cannot justify morality. This is the point, right? Atheists would like to believe, which is faith, that morality or ethics was developed based on natural selection, but natural selection has to do with biology, not transcendent philosophical standards that are non-existent in an atheistic worldview. That's very, very simple and should be obvious. Atheists can know what right and wrong are, they just can't justify it. Thus, they argue ethics, but search in vain for a standard beyond their own individual opinion or preference. They have nothing to base it in, other than, this is what I think. Well, that's fine, but that's opinion. That's not an ethic. That's not a moral position, because morality is something that is imposed, that I need to do, that is right, and I can establish that it's right as opposed to wrong, or vice versa. We are not saying, just so I'm clear here with everybody, we're not saying atheists are immoral. Many atheists are very moral in their behavior. That's not the issue, all right? This isn't like, one group is moral and atheists aren't. Hey, I know a lot of atheists that are more moral than some religious people. That's not the issue. What we are saying is that atheists have no way to justify morality, since they have no objective standard, because in an atheistic worldview, there is none. Apart from a theistic universe, our minds are our brains, matter with activity. As C.S. Lewis, and he previously quoted this earlier in the presentation, but I'd like to take a piece of it. He said, no intelligence beyond the universe, no creative mind. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It is merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen, for physical or chemical reasons, to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives me as a byproduct the sensation I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? You know, it's interesting. Some years back, I was scuba diving. I was on a boat with a number of other people. I ended up in a conversation with a guy that actually claimed to be a Darwinist. And so I said, wow, that's an interesting title that you would take to yourself. And he wanted to know why. So we entered into a discussion. Now, he got angry at a certain point because, you know, and he was a doctor. What I was trying to help him understand was that if he was an actual Darwinist, then because the evidence for Darwin, even by his own claim, is not in existence today, then first of all, nobody would really maintain that position, though he was. And then secondly, if we were just matter, then that means whatever our brains are kind of bouncing around in neuron patterns and everything else to try to generate a conversation. I said to him, I said, and he was a surgeon, I said, what we may be saying to each other may make no sense because it's just the random activity of what our brains are saying. He said, yes, that's true. And he got upset when I said, well, I don't think I would want you operating on me. Not with that perspective. Kind of ended the conversation, but you get the idea. Now, this concept was not lost on Nietzsche, who was the classic atheist, right? He said, or actually this is a quote about, and it refers to Nietzsche. It says, what is it that leads Nietzsche to doubt the validity of Descartes' I think, therefore I am? That is, what leads him to doubt that that the I is an agent that causes thought? Answer, Nietzsche's thought. What if Nietzsche's thinking is not produced by Nietzsche? If it is merely the activity of thought, then Nietzsche's I is being constructed by language. There isn't any Nietzsche accessible to Nietzsche or us. In fact, there is no substantial us. There is only the flow of linguistic constructs that construct us. But if there are only linguistic constructs, then there is no reason we should be constructed one way rather than another, and no reason to think that the current flow of language that constructs us has any relationship to what is so. This is a quote from James Sire in his book, The Universe Next Door. Excellent book, by the way, if you're interested in learning about worldviews. But, you know, the point is clear. If there's nothing beyond us and nothing beyond matter, you don't even know if your brain is actually doing thought or you just constructed this language. In other words, there's no external referent to know anything is actually valid. So, moving on, the atheists go on to claim within this self-interest, quote, a major aim of enlightened self-interest surely is to give and receive love, both sexual and non-sexual. As a general, though not absolute rule, we must choose those behaviors which will be likely to bring us love and acceptance, and we must eschew those behaviors which will not. Now, the obvious question is why? Because which one is, how do we know what's actually true or better? Because one person's preference could be just different than another's. The response, though, love is based on value and not biology. There is no objective value in an atheistic worldview. Since there is no referent to any absolute value, good or bad, how do I know what good or bad is? The next person's view of good or bad could be entirely different. How can love and hate be objectively distinguished other than subjective preference? In other words, one person wants to act in a certain way, they call it love. One person wants to act in a different way, they call it hate. But how do we know which one is better? it's interesting. Atheists want to always go back to this natural selection, survival instinct. And how do you know it's not better to hate to survive? Because many people have survived based on their hate. They've eliminated a lot of their own people. I mean, through Marxism and communism, we've seen the genocide of millions, and yet that enables the leaders to survive. They get rid of people they don't like what their views are, if they're not compliant or whatever. So that helps them in their survival. How do we know that's not better? This is the problem. So in the yellow, it says, atheists and theists agree love is better than hate, but why is this so? What if the majority decided differently? Back to conventionalism. Would that change the value system? If so, the value is not a value at all. In other words, look, if a value can just change all the time, it's not really a value, it's just an opinion. Values, what is good and what is bad need to be objective and absolute. If they become relative, they're just all over the place, and nobody will ever know what's true or good or right or wrong. This is this is a quick conversation between Justin Brearley and Richard Dawkins. See if you can follow this, and then I'll actually show you the interaction right afterwards.
But when you make a value judgment, don't you immediately step yourself outside of this evolutionary process and say there is the reason this is good is because it's good, and you don't have any way to stand on that statement?
But my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past, and I suppose...
So therefore, it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution.
Well, you could say that, but it doesn't in any case. Nothing about it makes it more probable that there is anything supernatural.
Okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact that we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. I mean,
you could say that, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so here's the actual interaction. Justin Brearley says, when you make a value judgment, don't you immediately step yourself outside of this evolutionary process and say that the reason that is good is that it's good, and you don't have any way to stand on that statement? In other words, there's no external referent. Richard Dawkins, right? My value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. Really? So therefore, it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. Dawkins, you could say that. It doesn't, in any case, nothing about it makes it more probable than there is anything supernatural. Brearley, ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact that we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. Dawkins, you could say that, yeah. That's a problem, but that is, at least he is being honest with the atheistic worldview. Here's the confusion. Knowing a moral standard with the existence of a moral standard. This is the problem and the error in this reasoning from an atheistic framework. They, meaning atheists, argue what they know. This is epistemology, right? What they know morally, but they have no external objective reference as to why morality exists. That is ontology, right? So epistemology is the study of knowledge. In other words, how we know what we know. And then ontology is the study of the nature of being. In other words, why something exists in the first place. And this is what gets confused. You can argue inside this little framework of epistemology, well, I know this and I know that and I know that, but the question is, why does it exist in the first place? Where did it come from? Why are we arguing morality but never recognizing the fact that a moral objective exists in the first place, and why is it there? The distinction must be understood. We cannot confuse how people do behave, in other words, what is, which is sociology, with how they ought to behave, which is morality. And people mix these up and confuse them all the time, right? Morality imposes ought. You ought to do this because it is right, or you ought not because it's wrong. That's morality. Morality is prescriptive, right? It is what we ought to do. Atheists argue what is. No, that's just what is. We see this, we see that, that's what is, that's what we should do. To argue ought from is requires a theistic worldview. One atheist must steal to then argue against it. They have to take an atheistic worldview and within that framework argue against an atheistic worldview. And oftentimes they just don't realize that's what they're doing. Like the college student that believes in communism but criticizes it to offer improvements to it all over campus. What escapes notice is the free society needed to argue the points which doesn't exist in a communistic society. So here is an interchange with Frank Turek at one of his I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist's presentations on a college campus. And this atheist, this young man kind of takes on this perspective, though obviously I don't believe that he realizes exactly what he's doing. So let's see how this plays here.
There you go.
Hi, I'm Kyle.
Hey, Kyle.
I'm an atheist.
Hey, thanks for coming.
Of course. I love hearing these kind of debates and stuff. You asked why would you be an atheist if you possibly might know if God exists? My answer to that question is simple. It's just the fact that there's so many terrible things in the Bible. Like at one point, Jesus says to one of his disciples, "It's great that they're torturing their slaves here, but only lightly. Even though they did nothing wrong, it's great that they're doing it." He doesn't give any reason to why he says that he doesn't do anything. I don't understand why you would want to follow such a God. And my question to you is why you would follow such a God.
Okay, let's not even look at the context of that passage. Let's just assume what you said is 100% true. Okay? As an atheist, why is that wrong?
Why is that wrong?
Yeah.
Morally, I would think that each and every human being here is the same. We all have the same rights. We all have the same wants and needs. I think we all should do the same. I think that we should, especially the God that we should follow, should have higher expectations of knowing such a God.
Okay, but you seem to be assuming that certain things are really right and people have certain rights, even if there is no God. How do you justify that? What's your standard of rightness? If there's
My
no God?
standard of rightness would be a fair society.
What do you mean by fair?
Fair? Everything is equal. I personally, I have nothing wrong. I find nothing wrong with a communistic state. That's just my opinion. I don't think it's something you can be afraid of. Everybody seems to be afraid of it.
Okay.
In the United States at least. But that's just my thought of fairness, is the idea that all humans should be the same. We all
Okay, so it's your thought of fairness. What if Hitler has a different idea of fairness? Is he wrong?
He's not wrong.
Hitler's not wrong.
He is not, well, in a kind of idea that we all have our own opinions. I feel like we should take the utilitarian view and go with what is best for the most amount of us.
Okay, but what do you mean by best?
What would mean the greatest positives for the most amount of people?
Okay, but you're assuming that you're assuming there's a best out there. You're assuming a moral law. Where does that moral law come from if there's no God?
Moral law. I personally just think that human beings should be able to make up their own laws. I mean, each people in time have found their own moral laws, and I think that they become better and better over time.
Better, but you wouldn't even know what better was unless you knew what best was. So I'm asking you, what is your standard of best to say that certain people are closer to the best or better than others? What's the standard? Is it just your opinion, or is there something beyond your opinion which says this is good?
Well, I mean, we've all heard about utopias and a perfect society and things like that. That would be great in a way, but also we've all seen like the books like Huxley's, I believe, I forget what it's called, but he makes a book on this
Great
perfect
New World?
society.
You're talking
Yes.
about, okay, yeah.
It's that perfect society that everybody's perfect, there's no murder, there's no any of that.
Okay, but the question is, and maybe I'm just not stating it properly, what's wrong with murder if there's no God? Why shouldn't I kill other people to get what I want if there's no God?
Because it doesn't help society.
Why do I care about society?
Because we as a group should worry about society. We should be making the betterment of ourselves.
But Kyle, you're importing a moral law into a frame that has no moral law. As an atheist, you're trying to say there is no God, which means there is no standard of rightness out there. But I'm saying this is my personal standard of rightness, which would mean somebody else could come along like Hitler or Stalin and say, Kyle, if there's no standard beyond neither you or me, then I can do whatever I want, including killing you to get what you have.
It's a very good point. It's a very good point. I can see where you're coming from. I don't think that God is needed in a sense I'm not looking for perfection. I don't think anybody here is. I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for human beings just to simply work together to better society. I don't really see that need for a perfect identity up above. I don't.
Okay, I mean, I'm not saying that an atheist can't be a good person. I'm not saying atheists don't know right from wrong. That's not my point. My point is that it seems to me it's difficult to justify what rightness is if everything is reduced to human opinion. Which human gets to decide, right? It's subjective then, as Levi was saying before, it's just in my subjective mind. If there's not an external reference to say that this is good and this is evil, then we're all just here and we're fending for ourselves. Now, a lot of people will say, and I appreciate your question, it's a very good question. A lot of people will say, well, we need to cooperate to get along, right? Actually, that's not true. Take somebody like Stalin. He cooperated with very few people, just his henchmen, and he killed 20 million people to get what he wanted. And then he died on his deathbed at the age of 74, shaking his fist at God one last time. He never paid for his sins on this life. Okay? So the problem, it seems to me, is we know, and you know right, and you know what's right and wrong, and I know it too, and I don't need to believe in God to know that. I just need there to be a God to justify it. Let me put it this way. A lot of atheists say, look, I know right from wrong, and I agree with you know right from wrong. But that's like saying, I can know what a book says and deny there's an author, which is true. But there would be no book to read unless there was an author. The same is true when it comes to morality. You can know what the right thing to do is and deny there's a God. But there would be no right thing to do unless there was a God. Does that make sense?
I guess I can see your point, yes.
If I gave you a book, would you read it?
Yes.
Okay, good. Before we go, where's Emma? She's back there somewhere. She'll be at the book table. Let me meet you at the book table and give you a book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, it's only a theistic worldview that possesses an external referent for morality, like Frank Turek so eloquently said. Otherwise, there is no transcendent referent in atheism, and morals are reduced to opinion or personal preference. Bottom line, morality is prescriptive, what people ought to do. Sociology is descriptive, it's what people do. And we can't get those confused. Otherwise, we will not actually be communicating with the same terms and the same meaning. All right, number 4. Trying in vain tried to make this leap, right? So this again is a quote from The Universe Next Door. For Brian McGee, and we're dealing with ethics here, no justification by God or reason is required for a moral stance or belief in human decency. It's kind of what, the atheists try to argue. We can just act as we intuitively know we should. Now, for E.O. Wilson, future science, pursuing its current course, will blend with humanistic studies and the arts in a consilience, or that's a concordance of evidence, that will support human values and aspirations. We're talking values, right? Wilson believes, in other words, he has faith, that because he doesn't actually have the evidence, he believes that discovering the material causes for our sense of morality will provide a sufficient justification for acting as we should. Now, still trying to import the ought. Actually, despite his disclaimer, he has committed the naturalistic fallacy of deriving ought from is. Few have found his materialistic reductionism convincing. That's the quote. Now, McGee's intuition is a subjective relative preference. That's what McGee does. Wilson's belief, or his faith, will fall short of discovery, for he already failed to notice material causes do not give rise to the immaterial, or as stated, there is no ought from is, not in an atheistic worldview. It's just not possible. You have to import it from a theistic worldview. So I think we're going to end there. This will give us an opportunity to start fresh on the next subject within the presentation, and we'll get into a part 3. So until then, next week, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.